Maria, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Let's begin with events in Russia. Lately, Western media has been extremely focused on the protests that have been going on in Moscow. What's really going on with these protests in Moscow? Do they represent real opposition? Are there any outside forces at play here?
Actually, this is our domestic issue. And ironically, this is the situation when the West, the collective West, the Western governments plus the Western media are doing something very opposite to what they were trying to state like a couple of years before that. So they were so insistent on such things as not that nobody can invade into domestic policy of their countries. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing right now, here, today, is just the opposite thing. It is a clear invasion into Russian domestic policy.
What are some examples?
In our domestic life. For example, when Deutsche Welle, which is supported by German government, we cannot say that this is independent media at all. They are absolutely for anti-Russian views to support. This is clear. We have tons of materials to prove it. And when this media, this outlet is tweeting, "Moscow, come out," this is a pure call for citizens of the country, which your media does not belong to, just to make sort of domestic policy activities. And this is absolutely not right. And this is absolutely does not go with those values and those goals which are and were proclaimed by the West. Democracy, independence, sovereignty, and other things. It's the brightest example, but not the only one. We have, for example, American embassy who is and was tweeting and going through social networks with their comments on what is going on in Moscow. What for? It's not your business. And we were watching America was going mad about Russia, so-called Russian invasion in American elections. And we were not, and they did not have any proofs, and they did not give their audience any proofs of such Russian actions. But we have these proofs of American invasion in our life. And so we have, I just mentioned, we have tons of such examples. And those are just pieces, very bright pieces. But if we will take a look, or if we take a look on what is going on a daily basis, it's absolutely unacceptable things, because they are just shaping anti-Russian perception for their audience. They want their audience, and I'm talking not only the media, I'm talking both the media and Western governments. They want Russia to be taken as an evil in each and every part of life. Please take a look on the situation in Syria, Russian actions there, European policy of Russian Federation, other cases, small and big. They just want to make Russia as a global evil, as the country and the nation, because they're talking not only about the government, they're talking about the country itself, about Russia's history, modern history, and history through ages. They're talking about Russia itself. So just want their audience, their people, to feel and to know that Russia is completely bad. And I think in 21st century, this really contradicts all UN resolutions, OSCE documents, all and every aspect of freedom of speech and other aspects of democratic life and society, it fully contradicts such an approach.
Some would say that it's overkill to detain or arrest people for gathering in a public space.
First of all, let me one more time repeat that actually this is up to Russia, Russian people, citizens of Russian Federation, Muscovites, people of from different regions of Russia to decide what to do or not to do. It's not up to Western media or Western governments to have something to do with the protests, with the meetings, with the gatherings, with the Russian policy. It's not their business. This is the lesson which we were taught through decades. And we are very clear with that. This is domestic policy. And other states, governments, and foreign media has nothing to do with it. So please do not be involved. And the second thing that, we have our laws which describes this area of our domestic life. And actually, we're not the exemption. Each country has its own regulations, how people can, hold protests or hold meetings or other sort of gatherings, how they can promote their political views and how they can organize any sort of political events. It's normal. And Russian laws, they do not contradict international obligations of Russia. I think it's absolutely clear double standards, because when you have your own standards to describe what is going on in your countries, like in Germany, in France, in the United States, in Britain, and you have other standards to describe what is going on in other parts of the world, it's absolutely unacceptable. Why is that? Are we from other planets? No, we're living together. We are human beings and we are united by lots of common joint statements, declarations, etc., etc. We, of course, have our local rules and regulations, but still, why are you charging us with other standards when, for example, you are charging yourself? It's not fair. And this is double standards.
Well, back to the nation of double standards, America recently imposed another round of sanctions on Russia, again claiming that Russia is guilty over poisoning the Skripals and demanding that Russia provide reliable assurances that it is not making preparations to use chemical weapons, among other things. Did Russia poison the Skripals?
This is the same thing with what I already mentioned. They are accusing us in anything, everything, in things that they are inventing each day. And you know how many sanctions were applied towards Russia within less than 10 years? From Washington, more than 70. Not 7, not 17, but 70, starting from 2011. And did the Skripal case exist at that time? Probably Ukrainian and Crimea issue existed at that time? Of course not. So this is the policy. This is U.S. policy toward Russia, not to let Russia be independent, not to let Russia develop its economy, foreign policy, domestic, domestic life. Just not let Russia to develop that fast that it started to develop after 2000. I think it's just a completely shaped policy which was invented not in 21st, not in 20th century, but used in nowadays very well, unfortunately, by United States of America. it's more than a year when we heard from Theresa May very aggressive rhetoric towards Moscow, Kremlin, Russia, Russian government, Russian people, Russian Secret Service, which were focused on Skripals, etc., etc. So, more than a year passed. What do we have on the table? We have none from London to prove their position. Just none, just zero information, just zero materials, just zero facts. We were asking 1,000 times to bring us anything, any sort of materials, information, facts, or something. Bring us something, give us something workable. This is one thing. Another thing, which is very important, is that through Skripal, so-called Skripal case, we suddenly realized the system or the systematic approach of London, official London, to the media and controlling and ruling the media. I have another expression for that. It's the system of controlling the leaks, when you are not giving information directly to the audience. I mean, British government never were talking to the media or to the world audience or just their people directly. They were not giving the facts directly. They were using just leaks from so-called Secret Service, police, some sources which are related to the case or are close to, for example, Downing Street, to control the information flows. I have one question. There are plenty of governmental services in the United Kingdom, starting from, for example, Foreign Office, Downing Street, Scotland Yard, and others. All of them has their press services, official representatives, and press secretaries. Where are all these people? Why are they not talking? Why not hold briefings? I mean, I just watched one briefing which was made by British police on that case, and this is it. But on another case, we had I think millions of articles which are written about Skripal case. I have one question. All these articles are based on what? It's not about journalists who were making their own investigations, because when you're making your investigation, you need some time to prepare it. But each day it appears something in tabloids or different sort of media. It's not only yellow media, it's not tabloids, it's each and every sort of British media. They're presenting more and more and more details on the case. Where are they getting all this? They're getting through so-called leaks. So nobody is presenting it directly. Nobody is talking truly and honestly to the audience. They're faking all the information, and they just don't want other people to see them, to see the government faking. So that is why they're giving the media only the leaks. And just take a look on Russian side. From the very beginning, there were plenty of people, I mean, official representatives, press secretaries, ministers, people who are presenting, who were on the screen, directly talking to people. We were eager and we were willing to make interviews on each and every detail of this case. I do remember Mr. Lavrov, who was, I think, the first to take the question on Skripal case. That was in Moscow after his press conference with his foreign colleague, and he was asked directly, and he was the person to answer directly and truly. So we want to ask one question. When somebody from Britain officially will start talking to people on that case, not through the leaks, not through so-called sources, but directly. And who is in charge, actually? Downing Street, Scotland Yard, Foreign Office? This is a question. It's a good question. It's a good question to ask them.
You just mentioned Crimea, so let's talk about that. Did people in Crimea want to be part of Russia? What, in your opinion, were their reasons for wanting to join Russia?
When the United States started its policy in Ukraine, and that was a clear invasion into Ukrainian life, they, as I understand now, their politicians, the people who were in charge of their foreign policy, American foreign policy, had no idea about the Crimean or even Ukrainian history. I'm not talking about ancient times. I'm not talking about like situation 100 or 200 years ago. Even modern history of Crimea, they had no idea about. And I can recall how in, I think, 2 or 3 months after Crimean referendum, Mr. John Kerry told Mr. Lavrov, now I read about Crimean history, and now I'm aware of what is going there. But the question was, where were you at the beginning of 2014 when dramatic situation and dramatic events and dramatic change happened to this region, when you were taking decisions, dramatic decisions about the life of millions of people? Why that time you had no idea about Crimean history? This is first thing. And another thing, which is very important, unfortunately, the West, I mean Washington and even Brussels, they just didn't want to know, and they did not want to keep in mind that Crimea held referendum, but not only once in their life. They did it not only in 2014, but they tried to do it several times in their modern history, starting from early 19th. And unfortunately, our Western partners just don't want to keep this in mind. Another thing I do remember very well when Mr. Obama, when he was talking about such things as democratic choice, democracy in the world, he posed a bright example with Kosovo, and he was insistent that Kosovo has the right for independence because they hold referendum, but they didn't. Kosovo never had a referendum, and we never knew and we never know what was the choice of people of this territory. But absolutely upside down situation with Crimea. They did have clear referendum when the majority, more than 90% of people, close to 100% of people, did their choice. They did it openly, with open heart, with open mind. They did it truly, and they did it absolutely with no contradictions with international law. And when I hear that Crimean people or Russia contradicts or broke international rules or laws, I just want to ask, what laws did they break? How they contradict international law? Their rights were interrupted, and they did not have possibility to fulfill their rights as the citizens of Ukraine for decades. And they were trying to fight peacefully using laws and democratic instruments for decades for their right. The right to speak their native language, the right to give names in their native language to their children, the right for education in their native language, the right to have roots with Russian people, with just no any sort of barriers from Kiev. And so all these rights were never given to these people. So they have the right for a referendum, and they did so. But there is another very important reason to stress that when in 2014 Crimea and Crimean people were holding this referendum, there was no legal power, and there were no legal leaders in Kiev, in Ukraine. Just none. Because they had a coup, which was absolutely against the law. When the people of Crimea understood what is going on with their country, which in that time was called joined, including Crimea, Ukraine, they understood that this is absolutely, it's a collapse of the country. So they did what they did. They hold a referendum. Absolutely clear and absolutely truly did so.
Let's shift to media. We've talked a little bit about media's role in all things Russia and Syria, but recently the British broadcaster Regular Ofcom fined RT $250,000 for quote-unquote breaching impartiality standards. And it's noted that the alleged breach, is still under judicial review by the High Court in London, and yet RT was fined. What's your reaction to this and to the accusation itself?
It's absurd. What is going, it's absolutely absurd. Because when, I used to work in the United States of America for several years, and I was watching American and Western media just all the time because the TV was on, and CNN, Fox, BBC, and other news channels. I was watching starting from morning up to the evening. And I understood that there was, I even had an expression, I invented an expression of Western media approach to Russia. It's the policy of zero good news from Russia. So when you're watching any sort of Western, major mainstream Western channel, you won't find anything positive or neutral about my country. Never. Only terrorist attacks, but not from the angle of that is an evil which world is fighting. No, that will be presented as Russian government mistake or result of a bad policy towards people. Something you can find about bureaucracy, corruption, crimes, etc., etc. Through all my 3 years working in New York, there were only 2 pieces of news blogs about Russia everyday life. And one, I recall, was about, I guess, ballet. Another was about a strange woman. She was holding more than 300 cats at her apartment. So, it's impossible. We're living a very interesting life in my country. It's very different. It includes everything, good and bad, nice and not nice, interesting and bright and different. It's not only about being bad or good. It's about we have diversity in our life. We have lots of theaters, museums. We have lots of we have lots of projects in different spheres of our life, starting from economy, business, constructions, and others, arts, etc., education, for example, sports. And we were presented and are presented in through the Western media only as, failed state or sort of a country which is on the bad or black side of the history. It's impossible. Even the worst guy on the planet has something good in his character, in his personality. My country is full of beautiful people, very nice, interesting people, nice events. Why we are presented on the screens of Western media as sort of an evil? This is a question. So when I heard, and this is not the only, that was not once, when, for example, in Britain or other countries, Russia Today and other Russian media was punished, charging with money or, for example, with withdrawing accreditation. That happens from time to time. I think once a month we are hearing something from this field. So it's so ironic to have only mainstream representing Russia as a bad country all the time. And on another hand, hearing that, for example, Russian media is criticized by being not objective. When you switch on, for example, Russian TV channels or Russian media outlets, or looking through Russian online media, you can find diversity of information about Western countries, Western way of living, thinking. You can find whatever information you need. It's not about black or white representing the West. It's about everything. But absolutely upside down situation with my country. So I think it's even not double standards. It's trying to control information and flows of information. When you're trying to control how the information is presented, if you're trying to control the media and media outlets, you are censoring the media, you are censoring the information. I think that Britain is censoring the media, not only through punishing Russian media, but through different channels.
There's an issue that's not getting much media coverage, and that's the issue of the journalist and editor Kirill Vyshinsky being detained, arrested and detained by Ukraine since May 2018. And the issue of evidence, Kirill has not been given a trial yet. His detention, as you know, has been prolonged for months and months and months. It's recently again been prolonged. The authorities in Ukraine claim that he's committed high treason. They haven't, to my knowledge, presented any evidence.
They didn't.
And I had the opportunity to interview him by email. He himself said, why did they wait 4 years to come at me if I supposedly in 2014 committed the crime of publishing other people's writings as an editor, all the articles with a disclaimer, standard disclaimer saying this is not the writing of the editor, but of an individual. So what do you think is the motivation behind Ukraine's holding of Kirill Vyshinsky?
I have an answer for all your questions. I think that Kirill Vyshinsky is Ukrainian hostage. They're keeping him not as a prisoner, they're keeping him as a hostage. And they treated him as a hostage. No accusations, no facts, no materials. They treated him exactly as a hostage. He's a modern, in nowadays, hostage in the center of Europe. And I think it's obvious because you have no options to describe this situation in other way. He's a hostage. And unfortunately, our Western partners, in European capitals, in Brussels, for example, in the United States, Washington is following Ukrainian issues very closely. They never pay attention to it. Did you hear anything about Kirill Vyshinsky from, for example, State Department briefings? Have you heard anything from Federica Mogherini? She was fighting for human rights and freedom of speech and democracy values all the time. She was using all these beautiful words. But did you hear something serious about Kirill Vyshinsky from her? I heard several times statements from Mr. Desir, who is representing OSCE, after dozens of letters and dozens of speeches we were made addressing to him, just totally focused on Kirill Vyshinsky's destiny. But I heard nothing from European or Western presidents. I heard nothing about the ministers of foreign affairs of European countries or U.S. Secretary of State. I actually heard nothing from other people or organizations in Europe or collective West, which are supporting democracy, human rights, and other similar things. Just a little bit from some professional organizations, but this is it. No campaigns, just nothing.
Yeah.
Do you recall what they did with Savchenko? I mean, Nadezhda Savchenko, her name, it was all around when you were going to, for example, Parliament Assembly or, for example, other European capitals. All newspapers, TV channels, internet, social net. Yeah, it was broadcasting 24 hours a day, Nadezhda Savchenko. But unfortunately, I just want to remind you that she was accused in killing and in being connected with murder of journalists. She was a professional sniper. She used to be in Iraq. Kirill Vyshinsky, he's a journalist. The only weapon he has, just a pen and computer. And he never used, for my knowledge, computer or a pen as a weapon. He was just doing his job openly.
And again, the thing is that the 14 or so articles that he published, that he did not himself write, they contained different perspectives as to what was happening.
He tried to be objective.
Yeah.
He tried to be a real journalist.
Exactly.
And that is why he's not even punished. He's just taken as a hostage. I can describe it only like this.
And of course, in the Media Freedom Conference that occurred in the UK not long ago, Kirill wasn't highlighted.
Oh, come on. It's a merry-go-round. You know, it's like a Brazilian carnival. It's a big show. I mean, it's a Halloween. It's a media Halloween, which they did in London. You know, the first thing, they did not allow some media outlets to come and to take part in this conference. This is unbelievable. When you're holding something on freedom of speech and freedom of the media,
Exactly.
You cannot refuse some media outlets to take part in this. You have to give the floor to everybody who has something to say. I just want to underline a very important thing, that Russia Today and Russia Today correspondents, they're not originally just of Russian nationality. They're just not living and working in Russia. They're not just, Russian guys who are brainwashed by Kremlin from their childhood. No, they're people from all over the world. I mean, Russia Today includes journalists from Britain, from United States, from Middle East, like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and other countries and regions of the world. They have different nationalities. I mean, they have different passports. It's not a propaganda machine. It's a place, it's a platform for journalists all over the world to present their views and their understanding of what is going on in the world. If you don't want that particular journalist, for example, to take part in this conference, please choose another one. If you don't want a guy from Moscow for any reason, but it's unbelievable to hear that, somebody is refused because he's from one country. Okay, take a guy who originally is from Egypt or from Middle East, but they refuse the whole channel. And that was not the only channel they refused. So, it's a show. It's a freak show. You cannot title it as a global conference of independent media and freedom of speech if you are refusing media to talk directly to you or to the audience. Another thing which shocked me a lot, that who was behind this, who actually led this show. That was British foreign minister, and now we understood why he was doing this. His part of show. He was, as we now know, he was nominating himself for political career, and I think as a minister he had to do something active, something attractive, something just to attract attention of the world media to his personality. So I think that was the part of his political nomination, self-nomination. But from another hand, we have this beautiful woman from Canada, Mrs. Chrystia Freeland. And this is another part of a freak show, because actually she was taking part and she was leading something which in the plot had the idea of fighting fake news. And I recall several years ago when she was insisting that she was proud of her grandfather, and this is good, we're all are proud of our grandparents. But unfortunately, she also added that he was a victim of Nazism and her grandfather were fighting Nazism, something like that. But some journalists, they found some materials in the archives, documents, not just tweets, but documents that her grandfather of Canadian Foreign Minister, Mrs. Freeland, he was collaborating with Nazis.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, she did nothing to clear up her position. Is she still proud of her grandfather or not? This is not the right person to lead something which is dedicated to the freedom of speech and combating fake news. And just one more thing. I think this historical parallel is very interesting because her grandfather, who was collaborating with Nazism in Europe, he was editor-in-chief of one edition which was under Nazis in those times.
Well, on the note of this regime change conference, who did they have participating but channels like Sky News, like CBS, both of whom have had correspondents in Syria, in Idlib.
But the Sky channel was the only channel in Great Britain which was interested in Russia's position on Skripals, because BBC was not very active on this issue. They were interviewing me, I think, probably through this year, probably twice. But Sky News Channel, it was more active. But still, they never presented Russia's position in general, global. They were just taking pieces to prove their position and just to make from your small piece of information a big puzzle picture which they already shaped. So it's propaganda.
Yeah, and I think this conference is about shaping the narrative, not anything to do with media freedom or concern for journalists. Clearly, when, again,
I think also London, I think
Julian Assange wasn't mentioned either, even though he was being held in prison within 24 hours.
Yes, this is another fake story. You have a prisoner in the center of London who is actually was the hugest, the greatest fighter for freedom of speech. It's so dramatically fake when you have a person who was fighting for years for the freedom of speech, and you're holding in this particular capital the conference on freedom of speech and not talking about him and not talking about yourself who were fighting with him. One
journalist did ask Jeremy Hunt about Julian Assange, and if I remember correctly, Hunt's reply was no comment.
Of course.
So, that again says it all about what this panel was. But let's move on to Syria. Recently, the account of the Russian embassy in Syria on Twitter was taken down for allegedly violating standards. It was then restored after many people complained about this. But just prior to its being removed, it had been tweeting a lot of information about the white helmets in Syria and Russia's and Syria's beliefs that there's going to be a new staged chemical provocation in Idlib. What are the reasons that Russia believes that there might be a chemical provocation staged by the white helmets?
Because we have materials, we have facts, and we presented these facts not only for the media. We did it both. We presented it for the media and we sent them, and we're sending them all the time to these specialized organizations, international organizations, like the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And unfortunately, those arguments and those materials are mostly not taken into account. Do you remember all the stories when Damascus and Syrian government and also Russia were accused by the West in committing chemical attacks, and we were trying to present our position, and even but the Syrians themselves were gathered a group of locals, Syrian citizens who traveled to Netherlands, to the International Organization on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, just to present their truth, to present their facts, and just to tell directly the specialists, the experts, what they saw, what they felt, what they noticed. And they hold a special press conference, which was not attended by the West representatives, which is crazy. If you are regarding facts on the table, if you are experts in such a serious issue as chemical weapons, you have to take into account all the facts, all the materials and all the information. And those people who were named by, for example, white Hamlets and Western experts or Western missions to the organizations, they came to Netherlands to talk directly, to talk from their own, not to be described and not let their position to be described through somebody else, but just. And they told, you can ask us any questions you'd like. We're eager and willing to talk directly. And they were not heard because Western representatives did not come. They did not attend the press conference.
So now an irony here is that one of the people I think it was 17 people from Syria that went to the Netherlands, one of those people was Hassan Diab, the boy who was featured in a video with the white helmets, purportedly treating him.
And he tried to describe what happened to him, that he was used by white helmets representatives, and he was not the victim of Damascus. And his father tried to describe the whole situation from the very beginning to the end, saying that that was not the air attacks which committed by Damascus, but that was something else. That was something which was set up. And they were not heard. But this is not the only boy, this is not the only child which was used as to make this fake story. Amran.
Yeah.
That was the hugest fake ever happened to Syrian issue. And it was not just the boy, which image was used all over the world. You recall how presidents, foreign ministers of different countries were using his picture, were making statements using his picture behind them. His picture and his image became as a symbol of anti-Assad, anti-Damascus, and even anti-Russian movement and policy of the West. And even more, I recalled when Mrs. Amanpour, she is one of the major experts on international affairs on CNN. She's a star. She has been a star for decades. And she came here to Moscow to interview Mr. Lavrov, and that was just before U.S. elections, presidential elections, 2016. And we recall and we know now, and we understood those times, that CNN was promoting one candidate. Absolutely, for sure. And so she was asking lots of questions, and suddenly, she never told us before that, suddenly she took a picture of Amran, and she showed this big picture of Amran to Mr. Lavrov, asking him, what do you feel, or what do you want to say, or what can you say?
And she asked, is this boy a terrorist?
Yes, and she was insisting, she was shaping the perception that Russia and Syrian governments together are involved in killing such children as Amran, that Russia and Syria is in charge of children's death. So she was doing opposite to journalist job. She was not objective. She was insistive. And Lavrov answered this question. He told the story, but for that time, there was no information about destiny and future of Amran. And in some months, it appeared upon his parents' story that he was not a victim, and their family, they were not the victim of Syrian government, but of Syrian terrorists,
yes,
as they understood that. You know what? We sent several letters to CNN bureau here in Moscow, and to personally to Mrs. Amanpour, just to have some reaction, something back from the channel, probably some sort of a report that they used this picture during the interview with the minister, and now they feel sorry for that because they shaped wrong perception, that they want to apologize, or just to make a sort of a report on CNN about this boy, and stressing that they use the image not in the way it should be presented.
Well,
we had nothing back. Only one. I mean, not only one, but CNN correspondent who based here in Moscow told me that he personally did a small, or not a small, but a report on the issue that Amran is alive. But I told him, you know, that was Mrs. Amanpour. She was and she is still a star of CNN. And why she used this material in one way, and when the truth appeared, she never corrected herself. And how can you fight for freedom of speech, democracy, and combat fakes if you cannot correct yourself and apologize for the fakes you made? And no answer I was given.
So Christiane Amanpour was actually featured in this Media Freedom Conference speaking on truth and in journalism, which is supremely ironic given what you've just said.
And you know that the MFA, I mean Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs representative, Deputy Director of Information and Press Department, he was not issued a British visa to go to London. And you know why? Because in that case, he would tell Mrs. Amanpour that she's lying. She was lying using the picture, and she continued lying when she did not correct herself. And probably he would also mention several letters which MFA sent to Miss Amanpour, and she never replied. You know, we have several requests from her for interviews, but to my mind, first of all, you have to apologize, and first of all, you have to correct yourself, because you presented the audience something which appeared not to be true.
Well, if she and the other media that promoted this image of Amran as the child, the face of human suffering in Syria, had done their research, they would have found out that the guy that took the photo, Mahmoud Raslan, was very close to the terrorist of Nuruddin al-Zinki, who beheaded a Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa. And the other note is that Amran's father was very clear in saying that the media had exploited his son. He said...
Exploited and abused.
He said they were trading in our blood.
Absolutely. And I think this is the whole story about Wild Helmets. It's one of the hugest setup in the history of media and information sphere. You know this movie, Wag the Dog? When I watched this movie for the very first time, that happened probably 15 years ago, I thought that time that come on, this is a movie, this is Hollywood, it cannot be true. But now, in our days, when I watched what white helmets were doing on the ground through not only through months, but through several years, I was shocked because I recall this movie. It just step by step, like that movie is like an instruction for those who want to fake the real situation on the ground and fake it into the surreal life, when you are just replacing reality with surreal, with something which never happened in reality. So what Wild Helmets is doing, it's unbelievable. I think it's one big mess, it's one huge fake. And all the stories with Wild Helmets and Nobel Prize, all the stories with White Helmets and Oscar and other nominees and nominations, it's a huge mess. I think that I hope that very soon the Western audience would know the truth, the full story of Wild Helmets, that they are very close to terrorists. They were involved in terrorist activities, that they really fight it for big money, and they were realizing not the humanitarian goals, but all their activities was for money and for policy of some states, including United States. I'm meeting a lot of foreign correspondents and the audience and just people, and they ask me, it's impossible to such a great fake to happen in our days. And I always and I'm always trying to let them recall when Mr. Powell, who was Secretary of State, one of the most respectful politicians and official representatives of US government, was faking with this tube full of something white, some white powder, sitting at the round table at Security Council, trying to convince the world audience that Security Council should start an operation in Iraq because of the weapon of mass destruction. And that was fake. And that fake was committed by official government. That fake happened because of the United States strategy in the region. And he did it. He did it. In some years, he admitted that that was a mistake. That was a mistake which was based on the facts which never happened, etc., etc. But in nowadays, we call that fake. And if that fake happened 15 years ago, why the same people, the same politicians which were in power that days are not trying to commit same fake? So this is the question.
Yeah, the fakery has been repeated in many, many cases.
Technology is the same. Exactly. The mechanism are also the same. And the strategy and the goals are also the same.
Let's go back to Russia's role in the multipolar world, because for so long the West, particularly the US, has been the dominant power, but now things are shifting. Can you talk about some positive developments?
Of course, I want to talk about positive, but I think it's one of my roles, and one of the roles of diplomacy to forecast some negative developments, not to let that happen. So, in our days, world is, of course, changing. It's changing all the times through the world history. But when we are talking about changings, we are thinking about changing of the basics and of the legal grounds of our international modern relationship. Previously, it was based on international law, and it was fair because there was a world organization, United Nations, which includes all the states, all the capitals, which was equally holding relationship with different countries, huge and not huge, developed and not that developed, rich and not that rich. We had common ground to communicate, and we called it international law. And in nowadays, I think you can notice that the West is trying to escape international law or even destroy our previous ground for common communication as international law and UN Charter, and they try to replace it with rules-based order. It's some sort of a new and their very inventive proposal, so-called inventive, because nobody knows what it is, how the rules can be used as a fair way to communicate with each other. You know, law, it's something that you're working on, you're working out, and it is the result of a compromise. It's the result of negotiation. But the rule, it's something which can be established by one group of people. You does not need to communicate it, to negotiate it. You just establish it as a rule, as something which is accepted by, for example, majority or minority, but accepted by one group. And this is very dangerous because, as we understand, this is really contradicts not only international law, but also contradicts the international democracy. Because democracy is based on the law. Democracy cannot be based on just on the rules, and on the rules which are established by only one group of people. So this is a very important issue to be considered. And Russian diplomacy is actually trying to, probably not to struggle, but to protect the international law, United Nations as organization, UN Charter, as a very comprehensive and a very solid base for world to move on. It's fair, it's workable, it's sustainable. And actually that was a result of a huge compromise from one point of view. And that was a result of a big world's mistake which was made in 20th century, I mean the World War II. So that was a result of the world's nations, different countries and different people thoughts about their future. And it cannot be replaced by just some sort of inventive dreams of one group of the country. It won't work.